Hello and welcome to another edition of the CGSP Roundtable. And as always, I'm joined by two of our top editors in Africa, CGSP Managing Editor Cobus van Staden in beautiful Cape Town, South Africa, and also Jeronima, our Africa editor in lovely Mauritius. Both of you live in such beautiful places that I'm envious of you. And so a good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good
And
evening to you, Eric.
as you can see from my background, I'm not in my usual spot here. I'm in I'm not going to say a lovely hotel room, but a rather subdued hotel room in Bogor, Indonesia, where I'm attending a fascinating conference on China-Indonesia relations. So Bogor is just outside of Jakarta, about an hour. Gentlemen, it has been a very eventful past couple of days in Indonesia. I mean, by any standards, this is quite remarkable. Let me just tell you what's been going on here. So, Cobus, yesterday, you'll recognize the man getting out of the car here. That is President Prabowo Subianto, and there he is. That is your president, Cobus.
President Cupcake.
Yeah, President Cupcake. Cyril Ramaphosa has been in town he was here yesterday. And again, this is all part of Cyril Ramaphosa's tour of Southeast Asia and really emphasizing Southeast Asia relations. Cobus, this has taken on a new sense of urgency since the United States-China trade war and since Donald Trump came back into power. We've been saying for a long time that South Africa and other African countries should be looking more to Southeast Asia, both as a market, but also a partner. What do you think the practicalities and the political objectives are of Ramaphosa coming to a country like Indonesia?
Without having kind of inside info, I think one of the key things is markets. I know that the South Africans have been really interested in expanding a lot of produce, of their agricultural and produce exports to Southeast Asia. And I think secondly, it's probably also like other forms of funding and development coordination and cooperation, I think would definitely be very high up on the agenda. It was interesting, Ronald Lamola, who's the Minister of External Cooperation, i.e. the foreign minister, was saying earlier this week that he was talking in London at an FT interview, where he was asked about geopolitics between China and the US, and he was kind of making the point that South Africa does feel squeezed between the two, but at the same time he was then saying that South Africa, thinks of itself as a non-aligned country, and kind of he explicitly name-checked the Bandung spirit of non-alignment. Okay. So this kind of this centrality of Indonesia and the history of non-alignment, I think the South Africans also see themselves as central in that same history, and so this kind of south-south coordination on a wider level, I think, is also something they're really interested in doing.
Yeah, and
it's also coming at upcoming G20 as well.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Yes, that's also. But Geraud, you were just out here in Southeast Asia in Singapore, and one of the topics that you discussed when you were at Nanyang Technological University was that African countries need increasingly in their foreign policy to look beyond China as part of their Asia policies. And Southeast Asia, particularly a country like Indonesia, given its huge importance in its size, we're talking, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, the fourth largest population in the world. This is a major, major player. And so this was a topic that came up during your visit to Singapore.
Yes, definitely. This is one of the topics that we've covered, trying to understand how African countries can take better understanding and better advantage of Southeast Asia beyond China, to think of let's think of Asia minus China, even minus India, because those two big countries have been the one driving the discussion about Africa-Asia relationship, kind of putting aside all the meaningful countries. You have the Singapore, the Malaysia, I wanted to say the Taiwan, but yes, the Malaysia, the Singapore, the Indonesia. Exactly, not quite South Asia, but all those countries, member of ASEAN, that can really provide much more, a lot of market experience, a lot of diplomatic experience, and also a lot of learning experience in terms of geopolitical relation. You talked about Indonesia and how South Africa like and how the non-alignment, we saw how Indonesia was kind of clear, saying that they will not ban Chinese using by Chinese ship in the trade. And we also how South Africa was claiming its non-alignment position to being able to deal with Washington, also to deal with Beijing and Moscow at the same time. We see the same spirit in Indonesia. So there's a lot that African countries can learn from Southeast Asia in terms of like natural resources management, or a lot of trade relationship with China and other countries in the global north and the global south as well. So basically, I do believe that those kind of engagement are useful in the long term on how African are now basically have to move up into the discussion of geopolitical tension. Mind you, in a context where you have US-China tension, I think the African countries need to think of like, what could be our leverage into maintaining our non-alignment position, if not aligning with other global south countries like those in Southeast Asia?
That's right. Well, in South Africa, let's not forget, has observer status at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. That's a status that I think is going to become increasingly important. Cobus, one of the other interesting parallels between South Africa and Indonesia is, of course, on Gaza. South Africa being very outspoken on this, and Indonesia being among the most vocal critics of both Israel and the United States. And we're talking 1 to 2 million people filled the streets of Jakarta to protest what was happening in Gaza. Indonesian soldiers have been delivering aid to Palestinians. So this is an area of commonality too between these two countries, and a very important one. Again, the U.S. sits in the background of all that, of course.
Yeah, I think this seen from the one side, this is kind of growing South-South coordination around these issues, and with it also an interesting kind of development, I think, of ideas of humanitarian justice that are not located in Western law necessarily, or obviously South Africa is Western law, but it's not necessarily located in Western experience and Western history. So that is a very kind of notable shift. I think it's in negative space. What it shows me is how much influence I think the collective West, the kind of Atlantic Alliance, has lost over the last 2-3 years, around this issue. Like I think any idea of Europe or the United States still being leaders on human rights has largely evaporated due to Gaza, I think.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning that it's been a very busy week in Jakarta here in Indonesia. And so what you're seeing now is this is on the following day, President Lula from Brazil is in town. So we first had Ramaphosa, then we have Lula in town. So this was today. So it's been a busy day for the Presidential Honor Guard in Jakarta.
Yeah, they got a workout.
They've got a workout. And so here you can see Indonesian TV coverage of what's been going on. That too has symbolism. Lula, of course, is been quite confrontational with the United States. Interesting other events that have happened in the past couple of weeks that kind of shape all of this is that the Indonesian military made a rather interesting decision to become the first country in Southeast Asia, one of the first countries in the world, to agree to buy $9 billion worth of J-10 fighter jets from the Chinese. So the Indonesians will now have Turkish fighter jets, French fighter jets, U.S. fighter jets, and Chinese fighter jets. All of this kind of reinforces, Cobus, what you're talking about in terms of the non-aligned status of Indonesia. I wonder how they're going to get those all to talk to each other. But nonetheless, here we are with Lula, and you see this real kind of convening of global South powers in Jakarta. Geraud, what's your take on this, on Lula?
Probo has been really busy having all the BRICS countries on his some of the main BRICS countries in his capital city. So as I was saying earlier, I think that it's also part of the upcoming G20 that are going to come in South Africa. I think those countries need to speak and to have certain alignment about their agenda and how they're going to move forward on around certain issue. We have climate change issue, we have financial issue that needs also to be addressed. So many issues they have. I think there's going to be a need of coordination on how to address those kind of issues, and especially in a context of a geopolitical tension. And I was mentioning, so having Ramaphosa, having and Lula on the during this conversation, I can assume that the G20 conversation is going to be quite interesting to follow. Basically, when you have Donald Trump, we still don't know if it's going to come, but still going to have to be interesting how kind of posture those countries are going to take, because I do believe it's a part of a much larger strategy into adopting a diplomatic position to the United States.
And one
In
other
today's newsletter, I was we were just on that issue. Like, we were like noting that there's rumors in the Brazilian press today, this week, that Lula may be meeting with Trump in Malaysia. For, I guess, the ASEAN summit, and then
The ASEAN summit,
APEC
that's right.
summit is coming in Korea the week
South
after.
Korea, yeah.
And so it'll, if they get together, it hasn't been confirmed on the US side, but like if they get together, that would be notable, I think.
Yeah. And again, Donald Trump's presence at the ASEAN summit was contingent that he was going to oversee the signing ceremony between the Thais and the Cambodians. And they insisted, as part of their attendance, that the Chinese not be in the room for that. So we will see how the Malaysians handle that request. One other very quick point that you saw a peek of earlier. Also on Thursday, a very senior Saudi delegation is in town for infrastructure, clean energy ties, and this follows the Qataris have been coming here. Indonesia Gulf relations are expanding at a very rapid pace. And the reason why this is all relevant for the China Global South project, in Cobus and Geraud, both of you, what I find that's so interesting here is how the reconfiguring of the global system, the international alignments, is happening so fast now outside of the US. And I'm not entirely sure that most Americans have any clue that this kind of thing is happening at the pace that it's happening at. And I think these kinds of engagements at all these different levels are happening so quickly. So just wanted to bring these issues to you.
I even wonder if most Americans do care about those reshaping that are taking place. And
I don't think so.
Except people in DC, maybe they are paying. Even in DC, I doubt that many people are paying attention to that.
I don't think they are.
There is that sense of like, we are the United States, we are dictating the term, and they seem kind of oblivious to the way that countries in the global south are kind of understanding there is a time now to reconfigure the conversation, to reconfigure the international system. And we've talked about it before. All this narrative, all this push from the United States are really just making the argument and strengthening the argument from China of saying we need a new international system. We need to reform the international system. So when you see all those postures coming from Washington, D.C., when you're South Africa, you're Brazil, you're Indonesia, you're Philippines, you're all those powerful countries in the global south, you understand that if we go alone, we're going to die. We have to go in pack. We have to start talking to each other. We have to start aligning and coordinating our move, our political move, and even our diplomatic stance on certain issue in a way that we can still exist. And when time comes, if there needs confrontation, we can still stand together in those contexts where things are becoming more and more difficult.
Cobus, I've been at this conference. It's a 2-day conference in Indonesia, bringing together Chinese and Indonesian stakeholders. I feel very privileged to be part of these discussions. Same, Geraud, when I've participated in African discussions, being an outsider to these discussions and having the opportunity to listen and learn from the various stakeholders. One of the things that's taken me by surprise is there's no talk of the US. It's not because anybody's wanting to avoid it. It's just not relevant. There's just not anything to really talk about. The U.S. is not a major, supporter of development assistance anymore. USAID is gone. The United States is out of JETP, which was, and Indonesia was a major JETP recipient country.
South Africa as well.
And South Africa as well, and Vietnam. The U.S., Probo is buying Chinese jets, so as a security provider and security, procurement source, not the only game in town anymore. And we're with a lot of young Indonesians at this conference, and it never came up today. No one ever brought it up. And there's an urgency of development. I think it's a luxury for a country to pine over. What do they think in Washington about, X, Y, and Z? Let's not forget that it was no less than 2 months ago that young people were ripping the streets of Jakarta into pieces. They are furious. This is part of the uprising of Gen Z that was in Nairobi, in Nepal, in Manila, and here in Jakarta. And so one of the reasons I think they're not talking about the US is because they just don't have time to waste over this stuff. You don't want to do it. You don't want to play in the game. Fine. We're moving on. We're bringing the Saudis, the Brazilians, the South Africans, the Chinese. We're moving on because we can't afford to sit around and see what Donald Trump does today or tomorrow. I mean, I'd just like to get your take on that, Cobus.
Well, that kind of brings me back to the comment that you and Geraud were making, that people in DC probably don't care, about this, which I think is true, but I think it's worth unpacking what that not caring constitutes, right? Kind of because on the one hand, it kind of, I think particularly from within a Beltway kind of context, there's just obviously this assumption of ongoing American strength, as Geraud was saying, and not having to care, right? But on the other hand, like from the outside, it also is starting to look a little bit like, obviously taking a very American metaphor, which is from Looney Tunes cartoons. Remember in Looney Tunes cartoons when a character would run over the side of a cliff and keep running in clear air until they realize that they don't have ground under them, and then they fall, right? In that kind of cartoon logic of like classic American cartoons, it gives me a little that feeling as well. Like the US has run out far beyond where beyond where the runway ends, and it's now kind of like suspended in midair, and now we're waiting, right? Kind of to see and to see what the reaction is going to be and whether there is a recognition of that. I guess what I'm heading towards, actually, what I'm really kind of like alluding to is the real question, and this is something that is still very unclear for me, and I'd love to kind of like speak with more Americans about this, actually, is to which extent does America, as Americans understand it, that concept of America, to which extent does it need to be the strongest, fastest, largest empire in the world to still be America, and to which extent doesn't it, right?
Yeah,
to which
we
extent,
don't know that.
Like how much do people in kind of do high schoolers in Iowa, for example, how much of their view of the future is going to get wrecked if America is the number 2 economy in the world, right? Kind of, and what does that do to their worldview? And what doesn't it do to their worldview? That's something that I still find very difficult to understand, actually, from the outside.
Here's a contradiction, though, that we have to consider. It is unlikely in our lifetime that the United States will be the number 2 economy. Okay. And the United States is about a $30 trillion economy. China's is somewhere between 17 and 19 trillion. Some have it down at 14 or 15. But it is unlikely that China is going to double the size of its economy in the next 10 years, especially given the fact that Chinese economic growth has slowed considerably now. So we may have a situation where you have the United States still as the largest economy in the world by far, by multiples of trillions of dollars, and yet an isolationist or a belligerent power. I don't believe that they're isolationist, especially what we're seeing in the Caribbean and what we're seeing in other parts of the world. So they're being in many ways a belligerent power in some cases, or whatever America first stands for in foreign policy. So we may have this, both may be true at the same time, where they are retrenched from the world, but at the same time still very powerful.
Yeah, I had two questions for you, Eric, but I'm going to start by the second one based on what you just said about America, and also based on what Cobus said in terms of like what does it represent for the average Americans or the future of America in terms of like not being second power, but having a different international system. How much the nature of the United States today relies on the fact that it's still very much entrenched to international system in terms of financing, in terms of soft power, in terms of all of that. Now, when we see how the United States is withdrawing of all the spaces and having countries in the global south, China trying to reshape all of that, how much, even though they're going to remain likely the first economy in the world, but how much that withdrawal from international system can reshape the way internally America is still working and how it's seeing the world? Do you see that kind of change taking place?
Yeah. Do you remember that soundbite that we played from Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno when he was in Columbia? And he said,
"Oh yeah."
And he said, if I go and ask anybody in Ohio, how much money should we be giving to Colombia for support, they would say zero.
Yeah.
And he said, we are tired of giving. Now, Cobus, you took exception with that, fair enough, but let's kind of dive into a little bit of this outlook here. It's not that the United States on a MAGA foreign policy wants to retreat from the world. They just don't believe that the terms they've had for engagement for the past 50 years have been fair to Americans, their perception. Okay. Donald Trump expresses this grievance. Senator Marco Rubio, when he was testifying in his confirmation hearing to become Secretary of State, said the rules-based liberal international order does not serve the United States anymore. They've pulled out of pretty much almost every multilateral organization that they could. They've also downgraded their engagement in places like the UN and other places to basically a minimal functioning operating. So it's not that they want to necessarily be isolationist. They just want to engage the world on radically different terms. We don't know what the consequences of well, yeah. I mean, on America First terms, in their view, but we don't know what the consequences of that are going to be.
When I hear the MAGA talking in terms of foreign policy, I realize it's a perception of like, we want to be the first superpower, but without the moral duty of what comes with it. You know, they say with great power comes great responsibility. No,
well, the Spider-Man said that.
Exactly. The Spider-Man say we want the great power, but we don't want the great responsibility of being the first provider of development aid.
Geraud, let me just stop you here. What they would say is their responsibility is to the American people.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Not to the Congolese, not to the Indonesians. So they would say there's a responsibility that comes with it, just not to you, but to them.
Exactly.
Full stop.
Well, you know, then is the question then becomes, what do they then want to do with the rest of the world? You know, because it seems like they have this very kind of like the only role really for the rest of the world is to defer to them. You know, kind of like when the rest of the world has anything more to say than just, oh, you're right, then that becomes an immediate problem, right?
Donald Trump has been abundantly clear about that there is a hierarchy in the world, and the United States is first among everybody else. That is Donald Trump. He's been abundantly clear on that he wants people to submit to American policies, American trade policies, and if you don't agree, then you can suffer consequences like Lula, you know, go down your list, Colombia, pick Panama, South Africa.
And yet countries.
But the thing is,
go ahead.
Well, the thing is that the consequences have not actually been, you know, like obviously these countries are suffering in some ways, but they're not suffering in this completely destroyed way that would kind of like that would justify this stance, right? Kind of like, as you say, a lot of the countries are simply moving on. So once they do, what then becomes of this worldview? Right, kind of like, because then that worldview moves into full delusion mode, right? Kind of like where you know, kind of where they simply keep repeating the same talking points over and over without actually seeing it reflected back to them in the world.
But
and that then becomes an interesting situation.
The rules have been completely reset now. We're entering into completely uncharted territory in the international system. We've never seen this in the modern era. So we just don't know, and this is what's highly unpredictable. By the way, we did not intend to go down the rabbit hole of MAGA foreign policy. It's always an interesting conversation to have, and it is of course relevant for China. But that wasn't our intention today. Let me just kind of bring us up. You want to finish up on this? I want to move on.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. Last point to you.
No. The last point I wanted to get you, because you're in Indonesia, you said that there was no mention of the United States. It's in Indonesia.
Very little. It was almost not a factor, and not by any conspiracy of any kind. It just wasn't relevant. I understand.
But I wanted to get, what was the sense and the perception about China then? What was the feeling about China?
Very positive. Very positive. And these are, again, not political people. These are very civil society. And they're not China specialists. They don't have a stake in the game, but they feel that there's a lot of relevance to what China's doing in their lives, whether it's in the form of trade, whether it's the form of infrastructure, this is the country, of course, that has their massive, beautiful high-speed train. We're going to talk about the railway debt that comes with this, but They've gotten modernization through engagement with the Chinese. This is also, the Chinese are playing a huge role in the nickel sector here as the largest investor in the smelting sector. Geraud, we talk about China's role in the critical minerals sector. We also have Chinese e-commerce, Chinese autos, Chinese technology, Chinese apps. It's very relevant in the daily life of your average Southeast Asian and Indonesian. And so,
but none of that, just for
clarity,
none of that is being framed in terms of domination, colonialism,
no,
imperialism, nefarious tricks, etc.
A little bit, though. The debt trap diplomacy meme came up today in the discussion.
Okay.
So that's there. The also what came up is this question and this concern about dependency on China. That if we're getting all of this technology and all of this trade, are we too dependent on one country? Again, what's very important in Indonesia is this non-aligned status and this multipolar, multi-alignment. And so if you are too dependent on one power, that could be considered a vulnerability. There's a very strong sense of independence in this country. And again, all countries have that to some extent, but here it right next to the surface. And so I think there is concern by young people, but at the same time, you have an opportunity for development and you don't. And so you'll take the opportunity for development. Let's quickly move on, because another big thing that's happened this week has happened in Beijing with the fourth plenum. This is one of these Communist Party gatherings that a lot of people don't fully understand, but very important. Basically, there are two major events on the calendar for the Communist Party in China that make all the difference. One is when they come together like they did this week to put together a 5-year plan. This is a communist centrally planned economy. They basically come together and they put together these economic blueprints which chart out what they're going to do for the next 5 years. They are putting together the 15th 5-year plan this week in Beijing. It's going to be ratified next year at the National People's Congress. But basically, we got an insight of what they're going to do. And I'm keen to get your take on this. The other big event is the National Party Congress that happens. And those are also very important, but we'll get to that later. But gentlemen, we just got a very rough translation by the legendary Bill Bishop. And there's a part of this that should be very concerning to people in developing countries. And I wrote about this earlier for the newsletter, which is that China's making it very clear that they're not going to give up the bottom end of the manufacturing sector, which is normally what happens when countries move up the global value chain. Let me read one point here that Bill, again, this is a credit to Bill Bishop at Sinosism. And this is from the translation from the communique. Let's see what he says here. Communique of the 4th plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And this line here is the one I want to get your take on. We should upgrade and enhance traditional industries. That's the key line. Foster and expand emerging and future industries. Promote high quality and efficient development of the service sector and build a modern infrastructure system. The reason why this is so important is because when Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, when they started developing, they went from agriculture to making tennis shoes, to making tennis rackets, to making light technology, and then heavy industry, and then went on into services and tech. As they moved up, they released the bottom end of the manufacturing sector for Vietnam, Cambodia, poorer countries to then take it. China's doing something different here. Xi Jinping has made it very clear, and the 4th plenum in the communique is saying it out loud, and she has said it previously back in April at a 5-year plan seminar that they put together. She came out and said, we're not going to give up the bottom end of the manufacturing. So Geraud, if you are South Africa, if you are Congo, if you are Indonesia, if you are any developing country that's hoping to produce something more than just a raw material that gets sent to China, this is going to be very hard to match the China price, because the Chinese have done a manufacturing marvel on the world by being able to produce goods at a scale and price that is unbeatable by pretty much anybody else. So how does a country like the DRC or Mauritius ever compete if China's not going to back out of the bottom end of the manufacturing sector?
We're gonna have to be innovative in a way that we see our economy in the way we see ourselves and transforming ourselves. The reality is the context under China is operating is a context where China was clear with the rest of the world, especially under Xi Jinping, that they're aiming and striving for self-autonomy and self-independence in every aspect of the economy. They made sure, especially in the context where today you have all those tension about geopolitical tension and access on different minerals and different aspect of the economy and the trade. You should not be expecting China to say, you know what, I'm going to give certain part of my manufacturing industry, given that you do have a very uneven situation in China where certain part of the countries are rich, others are poor, and China really relies on that part of the manufacture to be able to lift other part of the countries out of poverty. So asking China to export or to relinquish those bottom part of the manufacture is basically asking China to keep all those people under poverty, which is not really the case. And we all know how much China built its legitimacy over the fact that it's taking people out of poverty. So for China, it's an existential threat, both internally and externally. So for what does it mean for us? We're going to have to find out on how we're going to have to exist in a new context like this.
I want to show you both a video that the Financial Times put out this week. And I want to get your reaction again in the context of what are the implications for a country like South Africa, Cobus, that does have a manufacturing sector. But it's not just that China wants to hold on to these low-end manufacturing jobs. They also want to do it in a way that is really unprecedented. Let's take a watch.
Its factories with a wave of low-cost automation that is helping manufacturers churn out even more goods at even lower prices. This is being helped by President Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 plan and other advanced manufacturing initiatives. Chinese factories are now installing about 280,000 industrial robots every year, or half the global total. Economists believe this aggressive automation drive may help explain why China has defied the typical development trajectory of losing low-end manufacturing as wages rise. For example, the typical Chinese factory worker here makes about 3 times more than their counterparts in India do. But despite these high wages, research shows that China grew its global export share in labor-intensive industries like small manufactured goods, furniture, and toys from 2019 to 2023.
Yeah, that was a great little piece from the FT that they played on Instagram. Cobus, this is potentially very problematic for countries because, again, the automation allows the productivity to go up. Now, this is a very big problem for China, though, because robots don't generate payroll taxes. So as the Chinese population declines and as more robots take over the roles, the government's going to have a revenue problem. So there is talk in China right now about potentially taxing robots the same way that you would tax humans because they need to collect revenue, and it's very difficult to do. But Cobus, again, this is the conversations that I'm having here in Southeast Asia. How can developing countries find a place on the global value chain that doesn't compete directly with China? And this is the point that Geraud made, is that you have to be very creative. What does that look like for a country like South Africa?
I think in the first place, I think what we're seeing is the complete upending of 7-8 decades worth of development orthodoxy, right? Kind of the kind of ideas of what development looked like, how it works, what the kind of evolution of development is. All of that has been changed by China really fundamentally. So South Africa is freaking out about this. So there was an interesting kind of exchange recently where a trade unionist was like, there was this moment like Cyril Ramaphosa, the South Africa's president, was at a public gathering, and he was asked by a trade unionist who was referring to talks that one of South Africa's ministers had with representatives of Shein, the Chinese fast fashion company, while traveling overseas. And So the trade unionist was like, look, the South African garment industry has already been largely taken out by, or severely weakened by, by Chinese imports, cheap Chinese imports. What are you going to do about this? And like essentially, Ramaphosa didn't really have an answer, because he couldn't be bound to be like, oh, we're putting on, we're sanctioning Xi'an or whatever, So he was kind of like dissembling a little bit, right? And so that's notable. I think what's happening at the same time in South Africa that we've noted is in the past is that there's a real explosion in the fashion industry, weirdly, in South Africa. So South African designers have become a lot more prominent internationally over the last 10 years. South African designers are doing collabs with, like, one guy did a collab with Dior, for example, right? Recently. They did collabs with Adidas. Like, it's
But
big.
that's not a mainstream solution, though. I mean, that's a very small elite.
No,
issue.
but what that shows is, kind of, is that what I'm kind of heading towards is that these kind of global South economies are complex, right? These sectors are complex. So you may see value addition in one part of the sector and value subtraction in a different part of the sector. And I think, one of the things I think that Africa challenges, right, is this idea that manufacturing, large-scale factory-based manufacturing, is a necessary part of development, because what we're seeing increasingly in parts of Africa is these countries leapfrogging directly into service economies. Like, services has grown as a very large sector in South Africa, and it actually continues to grow, and a lot of that is very low-end services, things like food delivery, for example. But still, and there is a lot of that food delivery, for example, in South Africa, is now happening with Chinese bicycles. Would it be better, like Chinese electrical bicycles? I mean,
right? But are those sustainable jobs? I mean, is that a real?
Well, that's a different question, right? Kind of like,
that's
because
a gig job, right?
Yes, but we see, like, the problems of the gig economy is not unique to the global South. Like, the global North is also facing a lot of problems with the gig economy.
But these aren't real. These aren't substantive jobs.
Exactly. So, but again, like, kind of substantive jobs as we know them, as is another kind of possibly another remnant of old ideas of what development looked like, right?
Yeah.
But
so there's a lot of big question marks about, like, what these countries are going to be doing, particularly because in Africa this is the world's last youth market. Right, and so the kind of like the explosion of things is South Africa also over the last 10 years with the fashion thing. South Africa has exploded as a music power, right? Beyond kind of like all of its previous kind of like success. And South Africa is a big music country, like all the success combined, like, has been doubled. So so in that sense, like there is this kind of like interesting kind of like racing ahead in certain sectors while kind of being lagging behind in other sectors.
You are a country that has 60% youth unemployment or underemployment. What is going to employ those young people? That is the fundamental question. And
this is a fundamental question.
I know. I mean, and so if that pathway to development, which has been, again, what South Africa has been on, that trajectory of manufacturing is an industrialization.
Yeah, but South Africa lost that as part of the same process that the US lost it, right? So
right.
So in that sense, like, the idea of what a job looks like is this is the reason why the G20 has an entire kind of vertical just focused on the future of work, because what jobs are going to look like are fundamentally changing everywhere. So not only in the global South. And so the idea that factories are going to get the global South rich, that I think is a 20th century idea itself.
Okay, but Geraud, let me run my theory by you, because this relates to your specialty in mining and critical minerals. Here in Indonesia, we hear it at every conference on mining in Africa. We hear the same thing. Africans need to move up the value chain for processing critical minerals. Beneficiation is what they call it. Value addition, they also call it. I don't have any hair left to pull out, but what little stubs of hair I have left to pull out, it just annoys me to no end when I hear people say we need to own the processing. And I say, that's never going to happen. Okay? How clear can I be on this? That the DRC is never going to go the full step to producing a battery because it requires huge amounts of capital, electricity, water, good governance, infrastructure, and high-skilled talent to do. So the point that I want to make is that there's maybe, and you've taught me this, so I'm telling you what you've already known. There may be 17 steps to process a piece of lithium or cobalt. I don't know what the real number is, but let's just say there's 17. There are maybe 3 steps that the DRC can do well. So rather than say we are going to process all of it, focus on those 3 steps that make sense, that the Chinese would value, would appreciate, it would add value to their process, then negotiate trade deals with the Chinese that then do skills transfer, that do technology transfer, and then you build infrastructure around those 3 steps. When you've done those 3 steps, well, you might be able to go to step number 4 or maybe 5, but you can't go to step 17 right from the beginning. What do you think of that approach?
I completely share your point of view. We cannot just jump from 1 to 3 to 17. We cannot. This is just not realistic at all, given the size of our economy, the size of our market, the size of our industrial bases, and all of that. We just cannot do that. And this is the part where we have to come to terms that within a certain period of time, we're going to be able just to get to maybe to step 4 or 5 and take advantage of that. What the last point you mentioned about negotiating trade deals and a commercial deal with China, this is the point I wanted to make, in a sense where China is basically what Cobus said, is reinventing the concept of development economics, and how we see development model moving forward. China is also working into building a new international system and reforming it, all the things that are taking place in the international system. But China needs country in the global south. China needs political alliance in the global south. So the question is, how do we leverage our political support to China, or to our political support to China narrative for advantage when we have to address our industrial situation, our trade relationship with China, our economic relationship with China? It's time for us, country in the global south, to be able to say, you know what, we are willing and ready to move up to work with you into reforming this, because we're also willing into reforming, having this international system being changed, but we also would like you to address certain issues on certain aspect of our economy based on how you interact with us. And this is, I think, this is the part that we can think of taking some advantage based on how we interact with China, given the new context that are taking places. I think we need to be smarter on how to engage China to take advantage of certain issues. The reality is there is so much imbalance in a relationship that there's just so much we can get from the beginning. But I do believe that there's certain advantage, and China said it, we are willing to negotiate a comprehensive economic partnership with countries in global south, in Africa, for a win-win partnership. So yes, you say that, but how do we put it in concrete terms, in terms of concrete actions? And this is the part where we don't do that. We don't have that conversation with China.
But that is not uniquely an African issue. This is the same conversation that we're having out here in Southeast Asia as well. Where do countries fit on that value chain? That's a hard question to ask, because you push too hard, you're going to start building products that compete directly with China. The question is the Congo or Indonesia or India, pick your country, are they going to make a car that the Chinese will buy? No. Are they going to make a shoe that the Chinese will buy? No. Because the Chinese either make it themselves or they'll get it from, they make it themselves. They don't need to rely on Indonesia or the DRC to do that. So the question is, how do you have this discussion in a country like the DRC or South Africa to be very sober about where you fit in competing with China? Because you're not going to beat the China price. We've seen this in Africa right now. Njenga Akina, our colleague, has been doing some great reporting on how difficult it's been for African solar PV manufacturers to make panels because the China price is so cheap. Is it a good, that's a good example of what's going on.
I think the thinking should not be about how to beat the China price. I think the thinking should be how do we take advantage, given the current circumstances, to get our own development model right. Because what China is doing, basically saying that I look into my context, I look at my historical background, I realize that I cannot adopt the same development model that I've seen in the West. I created my own model, and being a large country, it has a large impact on to the rest of the world. Many countries in Africa, we are not having that discussion. We're having a thinking of like, how can my model or my political model, my economic model will align with China or with the US or with Western countries. We're not looking into within ourselves to say what should be our model in terms of approaching development, social economics, and all of that. We are not having those kind of conversation.
Yeah.
And regarding to the critical minerals, my point of view is like, I do not believe that countries in Africa would be able to move up. I think it's a lost battle in a sense where as long as you don't control the technology, you don't control the value of minerals today. You can focus on cobalt, lithium, nickel today. Next day, those who are controlling technology and the use of those minerals are gonna find something new. And 10 years from now, you realize that cobalt is not as valuable it used to be before. We're already seeing that. We already seeing that taking place.
It's the same with nickel, by the way, too.
Exactly, same thing taking place. So if we are thinking of things of today, we are losing sight. We're not paying attention. And this is where I join Cobus to say we have to think different. We have to think ahead of like what could be the economic of tomorrow and how we're going to fit into the reality.
I had lunch today with an Indonesian gentleman, and here's how he said it. And I'd love to get your take. And this is a little bit like what Geraud is saying, too. And he said, listen, we shouldn't compete with China to make a solar PV, but we should bring in solar PVs so that we can then build businesses that the solar panel and the electricity will allow us to provide. So there's an economic amplifier by taking advantage of Chinese technology that then creates cafes, for example, where you can charge your electric bike or your electric car because there's a solar farm right outside. There are all sorts of new businesses that can happen when electrification appears. You know, being in South Africa, what it's like to live with crappy electricity. And so it's just thinking much more strategically, but there are still conversations in Indonesia, in the DRC, in Nigeria, in South Africa about building solar panels. And you're just thinking to yourself, this is bonkers, because it's not even just the subsidies that the Chinese provinces and Chinese government provide to solar manufacturer makers. It's just the whole ecosystem of suppliers, of the network, of the skills, of the infrastructure. All of it is just optimized for this. So what do you think of that idea of strategically using Chinese imports and then building businesses from that?
I think that is probably the way to go. Like, I think, I don't think these countries have to beat the China price. In fact, they can use the China price for their own ends. But at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily such a kind of a one-to-one thing, because I don't think, I don't think, and I'm not enough of a development economist to be able to articulate this in a sophisticated way, but my gut feeling is that manufacturing success in China will partly drive other kinds of businesses in other parts of the world. But I don't think it's necessarily a thing where just because China manages to make flip-flops at a very, very cheap rate, that it's impossible to make flip-flops elsewhere. What one would have to do is to differentiate your particular flip-flop from China's, right? So yes, like it is hard for African solar panel manufacturers to get off the ground. But what has been surprising for me as someone who who keeps looking at solar in Africa is that there are African solar panel manufacturers coming up. I expected zero to come up, right? I expected, like, why would you try and make your own when you could just import it cheaply from China?
Why do they do that?
Me is that,
I mean, what's the economic sense of doing that?
I think it's possibly market adjacency. A lot of it is built on Chinese components that are cheaply imported, again, using the China price. Some of it is done in co-investment with Chinese actors. There's a lot of gray areas in that field, right? The thing that isn't going away is the massive reality of the emerging African market. Like, Africa is the last emerging market of any real significance in the world, right? Like, it still is a poor emerging market, but it really is the only one there. And so, so in
Some
that
people would
sense,
say
like in
Southeast
terms
Asia is still in that same space too.
it is, but it's aging out of it, right? The Africa's going to be the last place with actual young people. And so and these are young people who are ready to buy stuff, even if they don't 100% have the money yet. So in that sense, like kind of that has its own kind of polarity, its own kind of like weight in the kind of space-time continuum, of the economy. That we still have to work out exactly what that's going to be. But my feeling is that it kind of the China price may end up being more productive for certain kinds of development while it takes out other kinds of development. I think, but I can't 100% work out in sophisticated terms how that is going to look.
I believe wanting to beat the China price is the idea of wanting to compete in a space where maybe we don't have a place to compete yet. And I think focusing on that, it's us losing sight of like where we are today and what could be our potential advantage that we do have today that we can work on today. And that's why I say not focus. There's no point of trying to focus on beating China price when you don't have the manufacturer base to do that. It's just waste of money, waste of resources. When you depend on IMF and World Bank and grant and all of that, you have 2, 4, 5, 6 billion. Why would you want to put that in a sector where you would not be able to beat the China price? Where actually you can put that money into education, into public services, in places where you're going to improve your quality of life and your expertise for the next 10, 15 years. And this is why, for me, it's like for certain country, we should be leaving the debate about, supply chain aside to say, you know what, it's not our space yet. We are not there yet. What can we do best with what we have right now? And little by 15 years, 20 years from now, we're going to get there, but not yet today. And we are not ready to have those conversations.
Okay, I want to get to our very last topic. We talked very briefly at the beginning of the show about railways and railway debt. Some news, again, back in Indonesia. I did not intend for this to be an all-Indonesian show, but the way it is. But potentially some very big news coming out of a railway debt restructuring talks. And again, this has been a very important week in China Global South debt restructurings. And so we're getting the first word that came out on Thursday that Indonesia's sovereign wealth fund, Dananatara, says that China train debt, the talks are still underway. This is for $7.3 billion for this beautiful, this is called the Whoosh train. And it's a little bit different than the way they have the debt with, say, the standard gauge railway in Kenya, where that is a country-to-country, sovereign-to-sovereign loan, where the Kenyan government borrowed about $6.4 billion from the China Exim Bank. Very simple. What the Indonesians did is they created a joint venture that was managed by both the Chinese and the Indonesians. That holds the $7.3 billion of debt. Interestingly, what they're talking about here, and this is coming out of the presidential economic advisor, Luhut Binsar Panjaitan. I'm not saying his name right, but luckily Indonesians love to go by single names. Luhut is his name that they go by. And he is saying, again, this is very preliminary, that they are reportedly agreed to restructure the loans over 60 years, Cobus. That is something that is potentially groundbreaking. It has not been confirmed by the Chinese or by another Indonesian government official. I want to make that abundantly clear. But Cobus, this is very interesting. It's not the first time that the Chinese have restructured debt by extending out the term of the loans. They did that in Ecuador. They've done it in Angola. But by 60 years is much longer than what they've done elsewhere. What's your reaction to potentially this news of this type of debt restructuring?
It would be notable. I think it would be very interesting, and rare to see. I think China has in a lot of cases, or Chinese lenders have in the past. In the case of Africa, for example, we've seen several cases where African countries have been pushing for not even refinancing or any of like a writing off of anything, just extending the repayment window, and some Chinese lenders have been very resistant to that. So it'll be very notable. But another notable thing I think is that this week foreign the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun was asked about this, about the debt, and he, in normal kind of very oblique terms, said that kind of it's also important to keep in mind that the value of high-speed rail extends beyond just its commercial value towards its larger developmental and social impact, which is code for we may be willing to, kind of for the larger kind of like political and the regional integration role of these high-speed rail networks. China may be more willing to be flexible around the financing of them. We'll see if that actually happens. But kind of I think if we're talking about 60 years is much longer than other loans that I've heard of from China.
Now, to be clear, it's very important that Indonesia is not a country that's in debt distress. It has about a 40% debt to GDP ratio, which is well below the IMF 50% threshold. And so one of the reasons that you're not going to see the Chinese maybe cancel a write-off or do any type of major restructuring of the debt beyond extending out the term is because, well, Indonesians can pay back this debt. And Chinese taxpayers shouldn't necessarily be on the hook for this type of money. One of the other things we saw this week, gentlemen, which is very interesting, was that we're getting word that the Chinese are considering more African countries beyond Kenya. And we heard about the Kenyan situation last week, where they're converting the remaining $3.5 billion of standard gauge railway debt from dollar-denominated loans into yuan-denominated loans. First, it was Kenya. Now it is Ethiopia. And we are getting word from sources that other African countries may also do this as well. Geraud, when you see these talks of switching from higher interest rate dollar loans to lower interest rate yuan-denominated loans, saving hundreds of millions of dollars, what's your reaction to this?
It's a context of a win-win. It's a context of a win-win situation from both parties. China is winning by the fact that yes, now UN is becoming more and more part of the many central bank in Africa, part of the debt of the foreign currency reserve. Commercial bank is going to have to use that as well, given the amount of Chinese trade businesses you have in many African countries. In one hand, and on the other part, you have African countries now having the servicing. The amount of money they put into servicing that being reduced and being able to save money for doing something else. This is something basically it's a win-win situation. And for me, I was thinking about it yesterday. I realized that it's a part of a broader strategy of China slowly, piece by piece, is internationalizing the UN, the renminbi outside China, outside Southeast Asia, in African countries, where when you are another country, you're looking at like, oh, I have now the opportunity to be reducing the amount of money I pay every month or every year to China. I'm going to be able to save money. Why not taking it? Why not thinking of it? Yeah, this is basically a win-win situation. But if you're and I'm going to bring back the United States in this debate, in the sense where if you're the United States and you care about the fact that the US dollar is is your currency to be able to weaponize it and to sanction other countries, when you see that you should be able, other countries are slowly finding a way to clean up and to get away from the US dollar, you should be paying attention to that trend. So yeah, I think it's a win-win context for both parties involved.
Cobus, one of the things that I found interesting about these two stories is this part right here, is where they talk about $5.38 billion that it still owes Beijing. And then we heard in the Kenya story that it's $3.5 billion. We don't often get the updates on these loan totals because they often are happening and they don't report them publicly. But this is quite remarkable because Kenya started at about 6.4 billion. They've brought that down by 3 billion. The Ethiopians started at $14 billion. They were second only to Angola in terms of the amount of Chinese loans that they had, and they brought that down to 5.3 billion. So one of the stories that I take away from this is that, contrary to a lot of perceptions, a lot of these big African borrowers have been very responsible in servicing and paying their loans. That, I think, is one of the big takeaways here. I mean, like, to bring a debt from 14 billion down to 5.3 billion is $9 billion. That's impressive.
Exactly.
Of course, and that is, kind of in the first place, like Africa as within the global South, Africa has some of the best records in terms of of avoiding default and paying back
Exactly.
loans, and it gets punished for that with some of the worst risk kind of like penalties that the West can come up with. So I think in the longer term, in the future, I think the idea that people are paying Chinese loans in yuan will be a lot less surprising to people than the idea that they were paying Chinese loans in US dollar
US
to begin
dollars,
with.
exactly.
And, kind of like it's like, why would you use the US dollar for this? Like, why?
Yeah. Well, it's very expensive.
And with that, as Geraud was saying, like, kind of the weaponization of the dollar, for sanctions, kind of reasons and so on. Over time, I think, and I think that has really accelerated with the Nexperia situation in the Netherlands, this week. That idea that the US Europe is this safe haven for, like that just runs on along neutral economic rules, kind of investment transparency, and everything is just above board, and that's it.
Yeah.
Kind of it's the safest haven for everything. That idea has really, I think, taken a beating over the last 2 years. So in that sense, like UN, like changing to UN is a form of de-risking now.
Well, there's a lot of thinking in the United States that Donald Trump wants to intentionally to crash the value of the US dollar, in part because that will effectively accomplish what tariffs can't. Is that if the US dollar devalues, that will make US exports cheaper and imports more expensive. And so there is a line of thinking within the MAGA economic thinking universe, wherever that is, that crashing the dollar is something that may be on their agenda. So this pickup of using yuan and other currencies may be something quite fashionable. Also, very quick programming note, everybody. None of the three of us are experts in this, but next Tuesday, I will be speaking with Yufan Huang, who is from Cornell University. He works very closely with Deborah Brautigam and is widely regarded in the development economy space as being the expert on this and one of the foremost experts on this. So I'm going to ask him a whole bunch of great questions that we cannot answer. So that'll be on the next episode of the China Global South podcast. Okay, gentlemen, we are at time. We always try to keep this to about an hour. Want to thank you both for staying up late in the afternoon with us, or me staying up, but you guys kind of hanging out after work. We'll be back again. I'm not going to promise that we're going to be back again next week. We try and do the roundtable as much as we can. But it was great to see you guys. And then, of course, we'll be back with our regular coverage. Geraud, why don't you just very quickly tell everybody what's going on over at Projet Afrique Chine on our French site?
Oh, we have updated the Cobalt 2024 data. It's going to be up and running. I wouldn't say Friday. It's supposed to be Friday, but it can be Monday. We'll be ready for that. You're going to see the new data for 2024. We are also already working into accumulating the 2025 data. So by next year, you won't have to wait after the second part of the 2025 to have the 2026 data to have 2025. We're going to have that by the latest by mid-February. So yes, this is really basically what's happening in Projet Afrique Chine, and really, really excited to show you what we've been able to gather into data.
And we're planning another CGSP forum. Cobus successfully hosted the first one on China, Africa energy. Geraud is going to host the next one on this new cobalt data set and critical minerals. So keep an eye out for that. So lots of exciting things that are coming down the line. Also want to let everybody know we're working on a brand new nickel data set that's going to be coming out in January. So that's something to keep an eye out for there. Okay, gentlemen, thank you both for taking the time to join us. We'll be back again sometime soon, hopefully, with another edition of the CGSP Roundtable. Bye for now.